Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats.
Your whole life can change on you just like that in the blink of an instant. And if you're within the sound of my voice, that must mean you are in the seats with once more, as always. My name is Dave Voigt, and I'm the host of this podcast where we sit down with a wide-ranging variety of industry professionals and pick their brain about current projects, state of the industry, how they got started, and so very much more in a light and conversational fashion. And if you like how we do things, I'm assuming you do. You're listening to us right now. You can find us over at you can subscribe to the podcast. Excuse my dog outside if you can hear that, but you can subscribe to the podcast. You can find us over at Apple, Spotify, Amazon, Google, basically wherever you find your podcast. And plus, we archive every single one of our episodes over at our YouTube channel. And if you could subscribe there as well, that'd be great. Plus, you can find us on social media at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, at either In the Seats or at It's Podcast One for all sorts of updates. And finally, and I do dare say most importantly, please pay us a visit over at In the Seats, intheseats.ca, for all the latest and greatest from the worlds of film, television, the moving image in general, because we love writing about it and we love it when you come read about it. So please come on by because we would really appreciate it. Well, we got a good one. It's a late one, but it's a good one. We are talking about the Impact series, which is a fantastic online platform which shows really sort of impactful documentaries just about things that are going on in the world today. And they also have a partnership with our friends over at Hollywood Suite, and it's available on Hollywood Suite on Demand. The film is called 3.5 Minutes, 10 Bullets, and it's back in, it's a few years old. It's a little bit older, but it's a story from, it's a story that's all too common. One day, four boys in a red SUV pull into a gas station after going to the mall, buying sneakers, talking to girls, music's cranked. One boy goes to the store for a soda and some gum. And then a man and a woman pull up next to the boys in the station, making another stop. The woman enters the store, and then an argument breaks out about turning the music down. And 3.5 minutes and 10 bullets later, one of these young men is dead. And it's a story about gun violence. It's a story that happens all too often. With our friends in the States. It's one of those sad things about the gun laws and just sort of not necessarily gun laws, because I'm not necessarily an anti-gun person, but the propensity to want to stand your ground, the propensity to escalate violence rather than try to de-escalate a situation. And it's an excellent film. It's a sad film, but it's an excellent one. And we talked with the writer-director, Marc Silver, about just following this court case and following this family and just sort of the pain that has been inflicted on their lives, and just how not just the young man who died's life changed, but the people who committed the crime, the man who committed the crime and shot this young man, his life changed irrevocably as well. And it really just goes to show that when it comes to gun violence and it comes to sort of a lot of these issues, there is no winner or loser. There are just people whose lives are ruined. And it's an important film and an important reminder to sort of dive into that. And we go into that and a lot more with Mark in our talk, which I hope you enjoy. And please check out the film as well, and anything from the Impact series as well on their platform or either Hollywood Suite, because they're doing good work and bringing some really interesting stuff to light. Thank you, Mark, for the time today. I really do appreciate this. I guess my first question for you is, because I was so struck by the film, and I'm kind of curious, what drew you specifically to this story?
Okay. So I was introduced to the story by some people who had seen a previous film of mine, which was about the deaths of migrants in the desert of Arizona. And it's quite interesting that from the very first moment I was introduced to the story, I could kind of instantly see it as a film. which normally doesn't happen to me. Normally that takes me months and months and months to be able to like convert an idea into a film. But for this one, it was kind of like the writing was on the wall. And the reason for that was because I just felt that the character of Michael Dunn, the murderer, allowed me to be able to speak about this conscious and unconscious bias that is, you know, pretty much within everybody. And whilst all of us wouldn't necessarily lean over into our dashboard and pull out a gun, there is something systemic in the way that many of us have been conditioned to perceive four African-American teenagers with hoods on, listening to loud hip hop as a threat. And I realized that Michael Dunn was this very interesting way of being able to explore how and why that conditioning occurs. And obviously in this case, the result of that conditioning is like an irreversible tragedy. But I was able to, just see all of that in the sort of first minute of reading about Jordan and what had happened to him.
Well, and I mean, and that's the thing about this film, because I mean, we've had other, sadly, there have been other stories similar to this, and there have been other films along the same lines, but they tend to go into Second Amendment and gun control and issues of that nature. But in watching your film, I was so struck by really two big points. Just one, that everyone was a victim, basically, and just sort of, I think, like you were saying before, just sort of the predisposed sort of intent and idea sort of that is so pervasive in our culture to not just view that as a threat, but to escalate something rather than to try to de-escalate something. You know what I mean? Like, sort of that. I'm really quite fascinated by that sort of, that urge to sort of, the need to escalate rather than do the exact opposite.
Oh, you're so right, and you've reminded me that when we were there shooting, we had exactly that point came up so much, and it was just such a simple, just why didn't he just drive away? Like, why? That's all he had to do, was just reverse the car and move away. if he felt under threat, for whatever the reasons he felt under threat, but nevertheless, just hit reverse and move away, and you could have got on with the rest of your life, and, you know, with your fiance, etc., etc. So I think you're right. That is definitely a major point. Like, why instinctively does certain people escalate rather than de-escalate a situation? And I guess, you know, for me, coming from London, that the sort of extension of that was, you know, at worst in London, that might have ended up as a fist fight, or at very worst a knife might have been pulled, right? But obviously in the US, you know, with access to guns, you can go from 0 to 100 just instantaneously.
No, yeah, and I mean, you're right, because I mean, I'm in Toronto, and while we do have some gun problems, like, the result probably would have been very similar, like a fist fight or a knife or something like that. And it's just, it's really sort of, it's so tragic to see these things unfold. And I'm kind of curious. I mean, how do you sort of gain the trust of, like, grieving family members and people sort of in the moment to sort of allow you to follow them around and go through this entire process? Because I mean, obviously this is a painful thing that's going on, and I can imagine that for you to sort of engender a certain level of trust to be able to, for people to let you put a camera in their face, can be a difficult thing especially during these times.
Yeah, so it's, again, man, like, such an interesting part of a conversation, because so when we started this, it was a couple of months? It was some time before Ferguson. So sometime before the sort of beginnings of the Black Lives Matter movement.
Right.
So when I first met Jordan's parents, we spent a week. We had the camera with us, but there wasn't, you know, if I felt like it wasn't right to pull the camera out, that was fine by me. Like, my intention for that week was not to be necessarily filming, although actually we did end up filming some really intimate stuff that week. But my intention was really to kind of keep the camera in the bag and really just establish, as you said, like this sort of frequency of, you know, person to person trust. And then from that, if Jordan's parents were, you know, comfortable with that over the few days, over that week that we spent together, then, you know, I would come back in the future and we could work out, you know, the filming side of things. But actually, it was very we established a sort of very very base level human eye to eye trusting relationship literally in the first couple of hours, and I did show them the previous film I'd made, so that they had a sense of not just, I wouldn't just say it was like, you know, me as the director or whatever. It wasn't just about like my sensibility, but it was also about having, what would you say, like having a vision of what a film can do, in terms of storytelling and in terms of the sort of emotional and then the knock-on political or social change impact that a film can have. So the combination of me showing them this past film, whilst also just having a very like genuine, loving sort of first meeting, full of empathy and trust, just outright sort of set up our relationship. And then I guess, you know, over the course of that week, as we did get introduced to their lives and who they were, and went to the cemetery and went to the place where the mother received the phone call. We went to the hospital where, you know, where he was taken after the shooting, etc., etc., etc. As we shared in those experiences, I guess they, you know, their trust just increased in relation to the sort of way that we handled the sensitivity of being in those places and recalling those moments with them.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a unique thing to be able to sort of go through that process. And I mean, I think something else about the film, which I mean, I'm always fascinated by, especially in these types of films, is just sort of getting into the courtroom, because I've got to imagine that's almost sort of like the ultimate verite experience where you really just have to lay back and make sure that just the camera is on. Like, can you walk me through kind of just the logistics of getting into the courtroom and kind of being allowed to be in
Yeah.
moments?
Yeah, I mean, you know, looking back in hindsight, it's extraordinary that we managed to get that type of access. And as always, you know, some of that was luck and some of it was, you know, by design. But the combination was basically that, particularly in Florida, I can't remember the exact sort of legal, whatever the exact legals on it, but in some states in the US, we wouldn't have been allowed to do that. But for whatever reason, Florida allows you to do that. And as long as the judge gave permission. So we had some meetings with the judge, who was very cool, you know, given that he has to be super neutral and all the rest of it. He was cool. And he was like, he gave us the permission. At the same time, we also, the way that we managed it was that, because normally they would just have one or two like remote controlled or fixed cameras in the room, and that would send a video feed out to the media, and it would be like all of the media would be allowed to use that feed for their news reports, right? So we basically said, look, you're filming this anyway, why don't you if you allow us to come in, you will have a cinematic version of this, of which we are happy that, you know, we will give that feed to the media, so they're not losing out on us being in there. In fact, they're going to gain from us being in there because it's going to look better. And then what we'll do is obviously record all of that on our, you know, separate hard drives and be able to take those back to the edit. So it's like a win-win. Like absolutely no one loses if you allow us to do this. And that's like, ultimately, that was like how we set it all up.
Now, I mean, obviously, you know, not, you know, this is an older case and the film's been out for a bit, so justice was done. But I'm kind of curious.
Yeah.
during the whole process, like at what point did you realize that you were basically making a film about two victims? Because I really think that is the thing about your film that sort of makes them stand out from other films that have told other stories that have happened like this.
Yeah. So I think that was very early on because I was worried, forgetting like the real life part of it, just purely in sort of the architecture of making that film. I was worried that if Michael Dunn was perceived from the very beginning to be, you know, a sort of one-dimensional boogeyman,
Mm.
um, there would be nowhere to go with his character in terms of like the narrative arc, right? And then, as you said, it would feel like there is only, I mean, there is only one victim, but you know what I mean. Like it would feel like Jordan was like the only protagonist. Um, and I also just didn't want to. It was a little bit deeper than that as well. I wanted people to at least be able to identify with Michael Dunn, as we said at the beginning, in relation to like where it is that conditioning within me, the audience member as well. Like
Yeah.
I didn't want him to be so distant from us that we wouldn't be able to see a part of ourselves in him. And as I said, obviously there's a very broad spectrum between like me questioning you know, how and why my perception of a teenage black kid in a hood has been constructed, all the way, that's one end of the spectrum, which obviously leads to healthier race relations, all the way to the other end of the spectrum, which is, oh, I'm going to pull out a gun and kill somebody. That's obviously at the other end of the spectrum. But nevertheless, I did feel it was really important that we were in some way able to identify with, just at the beginning, with what was like Michael Dunn's perception, not his action, but his perception.
No, and I mean it's a bad pun, but when you're looking at sort of the conditioning that people have gone under to fear these situations, and I mean it's not a black or white situation. It's very gray, and I mean sort of the emotions have run so high for so many decades. It's really so, like, it's tragically complex. I think that's the best way to put it, because I mean, especially given things that have happened now with Black Lives Matter and all these other things that are going on in the world. Like, I'm kind of curious, for someone who has been in the moment and sort of observed all this, do you think there's a way to change it? I mean, maybe not through reform, but just for sort of understanding, trying to have a better understanding of people. If that makes the right sense, because I mean, there's no, this isn't like, this really comes down to sort of a very sort of confusing dynamic of how people are conditioned to be in a state of fear, especially in America, and sort of the compulsion to stand your ground, and the compulsion to sort of have a gun, which, I mean, I'm not against having a gun, but why do you feel you need to have a gun? I think that's the maybe sort of the bigger question that comes out of
Yeah.
all this, and why you think somebody else has a gun.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a hard one. Ultimately, I think we could all do with like a sort of literacy where we can see how we are played by people in power.
Yeah.
Um, and you know that that power structure, or those people in power, you know, really do understand, like you said, the sort of impact of fear, and how that leads to control. And obviously, I mean, you know, this is everywhere at the moment, but essentially that power structure is predominantly driven by a sort of white supremacist
Yeah.
history, whether, you know, from colonialism onward, all the way through to sort of extractive hyper capitalism, etc., etc., etc. Now, look, I know that, like, you know, that's not how all, on a day to day, I don't walk around like perceiving all that, but I think if we were literate to it, through, you know, culture and education and politician and all the rest of it, we would be more cognizant about when we are being played, and who benefits from playing us. And yeah, I know that's at a very different frequency, but I believe then that's where you are able to start seeing other people as the same as you. You know, that obviously there are like interesting differences, but they're not the enemy. You know, ultimately you want to be seeing like the humanity in another person, outside of these power structures. I mean, it's somewhere in there is the beginning of an answer.
No, for sure. And I mean, just to put a bow on this, because I mean, it is playing up here in Canada on as part of the Impact series on Hollywood Suite. And I'm kind of curious, like, as the film has been out there for a few years and it gets to more and more people, like, do you think at the end of the day, that's your hope for a film like this, just to sort of get it in front of people and make them think and make them a little more cognizant of just sort of the state of humanity and how we need to be sort of aware of it constantly needing tweaks, if that makes any sense?
Yeah, I mean, like, funnily enough, I was doing a call earlier about a similar subject, which was, so you know, what ultimately is the impact of all these films, and I think that there are sort of two impacts. Like, one is, if you're lucky, your film would lead to sort of a direct systemic change. Let's say like the end of the stand your ground law or something like that, right? But you know, most films don't achieve that just in a vacuum.
Right.
So what I've kind of come to realize, I guess, over the years is the impact that I'm interested in, I guess, is much more subtle and sort of nuanced than that. Because that's kind of how I myself am inspired and came into film. And, you know, it was like, I can still reference films that inspired me when I was like a, you know, teenager, which ultimately, like, the chaos theory of those films, you know, leads to this moment that I'm talking about, a film I made, you know. So I think that I'm sort of more interested, I guess, in these like tiny perceptual changes that people have as a result of seeing this film or other films. And then do those slight shifts in perception mean that cumulatively there's more pressure on politicians to, for example, you know, end stand your ground or whatever.
Yeah.
So yes, I kind of see it as, on the one level, on the sort of over sort of ego level, like, of course everyone wants their film to create a very quick overt change
Sure.
as
Yeah.
soon as the film's released. But in reality, I just don't think this stuff doesn't work like that, and it's much more drip feed, cumulative. It's like subtle changes to society that eventually create big changes.
Well, thank you for contributing to those subtle changes. Thank you for the work and thank you for the time today, man. This was a pleasure.
Oh, dude, it's very nice actually to be talking about this film again, because as you said, you know, it was made a while ago, but I guess I'm always interested in, you know, doing films about so-called zeitgeist sort of current subjects, but at the same time, you know, I don't know, like creating them in a way where they're sort of timeless and universal. And unfortunately, no, you know, unfortunately, this film is one of those. I remember every time I went to the US when it was released, you know, and I had to go back and forth and do Q&As and all the rest of it. It was absolutely, I'm not exaggerating. It's like every time I flew back to the US, I had to learn a new name of someone who had been killed, you know, ready for these kind of conversations. And you know, that nothing said it better than that. It was insane that that's what I had to do.
And you know, making these films is so important because at the end of the day, as much as you as a filmmaker want your film to be timeless and relevant, we want this issue to not be timeless and relevant anymore, which is kind of the point.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
All right. Well,
Yeah.
you know what? Thank you again for the talk, man, and thanks for the time today. I appreciate it.
You too. You too. All right. Take care.
And don't forget to visit our friends over at Bay Street Video for all your DVD, Blu-ray rental, or purchasing needs this summer, as they are still open for curbside and some mailing delivery as well. Over at 1172 Bay Street, Toronto, Ontario, Canada, you can give them a call at 416-964-9088. That's 416-964-9088. Or send them an email at baystreetvideoto@gmail.com for any of your DVD and Blu-ray needs.